The 2nd of March 1995, and we're at Davidson. Pat, I understand you grew up in King's Cross.
Yes, that's right. We went there when I was 8, and we lived in a boarding house because my mother wasn't very good at housework, and she was actually what you would have called a single parent in those days. There was just my sister and I, and she felt, I thought it was a brilliant idea because she wanted to give us as much attention as possible, and she, not being good at housework, and I must have been a naughty little girl, I used to have a tantrum every time she was cooking dinner, and I used to throw myself on the ground and beat my head with rage, and it must have been awful for her, and she decided then that she'd live in a boarding house so that she could give her two daughters attention, but it was an unusual thing to do, and my relations thought it was terrible.
Well, what year were you born?
1920.
And you were born in Germany, were you?
I should have been born in Germany. My mother was living in Germany, and she became pregnant, and she and my grandmother paid for her to come out here for a trip, and she and my sister travelled out. I was inside her stomach, and she had me here, and then in Darlinghurst, in Kirkton Hospital, in Darlinghurst Road it was, and we had to stay for about 2 months because my mother, when she was having me, her appendix burst. So she was here for 2 months, and I was being fed on Glaxo and etc. and looked after by adoring grandmother and aunts while my mother was in hospital. And then we went back to my father, and I can remember being on the ship, even though I was only 3 months old. Whether it's because I was told the stories, but people say people remember things from an early age.
So your mother returned to Germany?
Near to my father with my sister. But unfortunately, the marriage broke up when I was about 4 because my father was shell-shocked, and in those days they didn't know anything about that, and he had dreadful rages, and my mother couldn't manage the house either. That was they both came from very privileged families actually. He was a member of the German royal family, and we lived in a castle when I was small, and my mother had money too, and at that age she didn't have me till, she was born in 1882, so work out what age she was in 1920 when she had me. It wasn't really so young, and to suddenly have to turn around and run a house when she'd already had help, and my father couldn't understand why she couldn't run a house. So, it was very sad. And this is probably why I'm in the peace movement. I don't know whether you want all this, because my mother and father applied to come out here, and my grandmother was going to pay for them until he got a job. And the Australian government would have my mother and me because I was born here, but they wouldn't have my sister and my father because they were German. And even in 1925 the Germans were still hated. So it was really awful. So I'm really very against race hatred of any sort, because we had done nothing, and their whole lives were ruined by that. My mother never stopped loving my father, and she pined her life out here and looked after her 2 daughters. And that if the war hadn't come, they would have had a chance of being happy, I'm sure.
Mm. Was your mother was she Australian?
Yes, 4th generation Australian. My great-grandparents came out in 1838. He was a surgeon, and they lived in Elizabeth Street.
Oh, right. And so how did she meet your father?
Well, her mother took her and her 3 sisters for a trip overseas, and they met in London.
Oh, sounds very romantic.
It was, because he was very tall and fair and she was very tall and dark, and he kept staring at her in the hotel where they were staying, and she thought, what an impertinent man. And then he got an introduction to her, and then he invited them all back to his house in Germany, and his father was a judge, and it was a beautiful house. I think my mother was quite sort of impressed, and with his good looks too, you know. It was like a fairy tale in the beginning, which was really had such a sad ending.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. So you had one sister. Was she?
Yes, she was 10 years older than I was. She was born in 1910, and my mother and she lived in Berlin during the First World War, and that was a terrible time. My father was away for a whole year. They were starving because England blockaded Germany, and they lived for a whole week on apricot jam and nothing else, no bread, nothing. So, I mean, they had a dreadful time during the war, but nobody was nasty to them. But funnily, when they came back to Australia, her own place, people really hated the Germans, and I felt so sorry for my sister. She was 15.
Mm. She would have had a hard time.
Well, that's true. She felt really very sad, sort of, because, I mean, it must be awful. I often think about the Asians here. It must be dreadful to feel people are looking at you thinking, I don't like you. Because people are people, and, you know, I think it's dreadful to dislike people because of a race.
Well, I was going to ask you what your earliest memories are. You've actually said you can remember when you were
on the ship. Yes. I don't know, but I can remember the captain throwing me up in the air as a baby, and I was terrified. I could see the waves. I can still remember the fear.
Oh, you're probably supposed to be enjoying it.
Oh yes, of course. You know, grown-ups throw babies in the air and think, especially blokes, they wouldn't realise. Yes, that's right. And then I can remember coming to Australia, and my grandmother was living in Roseville then, and my mother and sister and I went in, and my mother went off to see my grandmother and with my sister, and I was left in the kitchen with my aunt. And my aunt, I could understand English because my mother was Australian, but I couldn't speak it. And my aunt said to me, would you like some bread and jam? And I'm feeling this is a very strange country where nobody understands me and I understand them. And I was very haughty, and I sat up at the table and said, "Doch," which means certainly. And my aunt, who'd expected a 9 or a ya, rushed off and left me to find out what I'd said. And I thought, stranger and stranger, I'm sitting on a kitchen table all by myself in a terrible country. Anyway, then my mother, I refused to learn English. I was a very obstinate child. I said, no, if I can understand people, they can understand me. So mother then forbade me to talk German until I learned English. So I forgot most of it.
And what's your earliest memory of living in King's Cross?
Well, being in Roslyn Gardens, and I can still see the house. I think it's still there, the boarding house, and was right near Rushcutters Bay Park, and I loved Rushcutters Bay Park. In those days, the Cross was a little village. It was as safe as anything. And, you know, I used to wander down to Rushcutters Bay Park with my friends, and we'd go to the baths swimming in the afternoon, and that was hilarious because I think some baths are still segregated, but the men swam in one side and the women in the other, and they were locked. And then I'm afraid when we were quite naughty, we used to go up to Darling Point, which looks down on the baths, and try and peer at the men who swam with nothing on in the baths from the hill up above. You know, those were all exciting things to do. I had a friend, Eve Raymond, who was also lived in Roslyn Gardens, and her father was a sea captain, and brother was very adventuresome, and he found an old bath. We used to wander around the harbour all the time, and an old bath there. So he put the plug in and he got in the bath and sailed out into the middle of the bay with Eve and I saying, "Oh, aren't you wonderful?" And he couldn't get back. And so we had to ring his father in the naval depot at Rushcutters Bay to say, "Oh, Ken can't get back, he's out in the middle of the bay in a bath." So his father, who was a captain in the Rushcutters Bay depot, had to come and rescue his son in Rushcutters Bay.
It would have been a bit embarrassing.
Well, yes, I think Ken got into trouble, and Eve and I were very admiring. We thought that was, wonderful of him.
Are we talking, you were born in 1920, so we're talking about the late 20s, are we? And the early
We're
30s?
talking about 1928. And as I said, the whole area there was really our playground. My daughter now, who now said to me, "Oh, Gran must have been so casual letting you run around, Mum, like that." I said, "No, it was like a little village. We knew most of the people, who wandered around, but if we didn't know them personally, we knew them by sight or to say hello." And there were a lot of characters in the cross then. Now, for instance, living in the same boarding house was Mrs. Zabel, and she owned the Roycroft bookshop in Rose Street, and that was a very elegant bookshop with art and lovely books, and I was a great reader, and she used to say, she used to take me up to the shop when she came in the morning at 9 o'clock, and she used to let me read any books I like. I went all through Beatrix Potter's and lots of other books. I'd sit behind the counter, read all the books all day, and then she'd give me lunch, and then I'd read, and then we'd go home at 5 o'clock. And then there was another character there called Margaret Jacobs, and she had an interior decorating shop, and hair that flew out here, she was very flamboyant lady, and she was very arty, and, there were sort of so many characters that I met through that. And, Rose Street was it's gone now, but the Australia Hotel was in Castlereagh Street, and there was this little lane going down, and that's where the Roycroft bookshop was, and Margaret Jacobs had all her interior decorating. It was a real little arty street, and we used to walk into town down William Street, and there were all the car shop sales place on one side, and on the other side were cheap restaurants. And I was always intrigued because all the old blokes who didn't have any money used to be there, and there were 3-course meals for 1 and 6pence. I always remember that. And I used to wonder what it would be like to have a 3-course meal for 1 and 6pence. And, we walked down there to William Street, and it was just such a lovely place to live. We'd go to the other park too, Elizabeth Bay Park, and we'd paddle, take off our shoes and paddle. And at night when my cousins came over, I had 3 boy cousins and a girl cousin, and they're about my age, we used to all go down and take off our shoes and paddle in the warm harbour water and wander around. And one night, Jess, there was a Ward Street, that's at the cross too, and it's still there, I think. And there was an old lady there, and she had this huge house, and she was terribly rich. And she was a character too, because she said she was going to make her daughter the richest girl in New South Wales. And so she was terribly mean. The grocer told us she used to come up and buy a penn'orth of cheese wrapped in. And in the end, her husband hung himself in the attic. And then her daughter, who wasn't allowed to see people or spend much money and was incarcerated in this very glamorous house, died from pneumonia because she never was exposed to germs. So one night, after they died, the house was up for sale, And my friend and I, Christine Wager, her name was, and her parents owned the Belvedere, which was in Bayswater Road, another boarding house. And Christine was always adventuresome, and I loved adventuresome girls. So she and I decided we'd go and climb over the fence in this house in the pitch dark. It was 7 o'clock at night, and walk around the house, see if we could feel the ghosts. So we climbed over the fence and we got round the veranda, and there was a statue there, like this white marble, and we both shrieked and rushed out and went home. And Mother was talking to my aunt, and they wondered why we came back all so breathless and white and agitated, but we didn't tell them because we knew we'd get into trouble for doing things like that. And yeah, go on.
Sorry. You know the boarding house that you lived in?
Yeah.
Was it a very elegant sort of boarding house then? Like some of the...
Yes, I've got it.
What was the name? I've missed that.
Dunrobin.
Dunrobin.
Yes.
Can you describe it? Your living
Yes,
situation?
it was a sprawling old house, and it had at the back, they built on modern bachelors' quarters. The bachelors all used to live in these modern quarters. But that was that was not the most glamorous place I lived in. The most glamorous place, and what I thought was the nicest time of my life, was when we, in 1929, 30 it was. And funnily, at that stage, the Depression hadn't hit my mother because she lived on shares, but I don't know, given by my grandmother, and I don't know why it hadn't hit her, but because I'll tell you later it did. And we went to this beautiful boarding house called Kinneil, and I'll show you a photograph after. It was the Hordens' old house, and it was in Elizabeth Bay Road, number 15 Elizabeth Bay Road. I can still remember the telephone number, FL4322. And it had huge garden, and with a gardener who always had beds of pansies, and the grounds went right down nearly to Roslyn Gardens, and these huge Moreton Bay figs in it, where I used to run wild. I was a bit of a tomboy. I climbed trees and ran wild and things, but it was a very elegant boarding house because we. I always remember the things. The dining room was very elegant. We had to. They rang a bell at 6 o'clock, 6:30, a dressing bell, and you had to. I had to go. Everyone. I had to go and have a shower, and I had to get dressed into some glamorous dress. So I had nice dresses to wear for dinner at night, and at 7 o'clock you went down to dinner. And the dinner consisted of, in the beginning, 2 soups, a choice of 2 soups. Then you had an entree. Then there was a choice of 2 meats, and the vegetables always came in a silver dish. And then you had 3 desserts to choose from, and then there was a savoury like Welsh rabbit or something. And after that was fresh fruit and finger bowls brought on, and that's a very funny story about that because we had sitting at our table one time an old lady, and her name was Mrs. Beale, and she'd made all the money from Beale pianos. She had a lot of grandsons, you see, and she was a very natural old lady, and one night her teeth were uncomfortable, so she took them out and put them in the finger bowl. And my mother, who was very polite, was annoyed with me because I giggled. She sort of kicked me under the table. I wasn't supposed to laugh at all. So it was so funny. And then the other funny thing was I was evidently an unself-conscious sort of child because I decided I'd like to look different one night, and I got dressed for dinner. I spent the afternoon. I've been reading a book called Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch, and and Mrs. Wiggs had 7 children, and she used to put all their hairs in paper, you know, to curl it, and then she used to iron it. So I spent the afternoon putting my hair in little rags they wear, and then ironing it. And when I came down to dinner, Mother hadn't seen me before I came down to dinner, and she and my sister were sitting there, and they were electrified. I came out with my hair like this, you know, it was a real afro haircut. And, you know, they both nearly died, because in those days that was so unusual, and my sister was sent to take me upstairs to brush it out, but of course didn't come out. So they had to sit with me, and then another time I decided I love ribbons. I got a broad blue velvet satin ribbon and put it round my forehead. And when I came down, my mother and Ingrid burst out laughing and said, "You look like a Roman emperor." I was so offended. I thought I'd looked so glamorous. So that was, you know, memories. And the other memory, which I thought was sad, when the Depression started to hit, I went to William Street High then. I'd been going to an exclusive private school before. I don't mean it was sad I went to William Street High. What was sad was there was an old man when I came home on Thursdays after school, 4 o'clock, standing outside our house with his hat for money and playing a violin, and it was that song about when the nights are lonely. I didn't know it, but I can't think of it now, but it was such a sad song. We had a dog. I used to go in and weep, and my dog's, put my arms around my dog's neck and weep on his neck, because I was so sorry for that man. It was terrible. And I had a very way out mother. I found her very hard to bring up because she didn't conform. In those days there was a terrible lot of snobbery in Sydney, and that's what I think's very good these days. There's no snobbery, and my mother was not snobbish, because one time we had a Hungarian gardener there, and my mother found him very interesting, so he invited my mother and I and my sister out to dinner at his house. And you should have seen the boarding house. They thought it was a dreadful thing. Fancy Mrs. Reck taking her children out to visit the gardener. My mother said there's nothing wrong with him. He's a very nice man. So I remember going there, and we had stuffed green peppers, and Australians didn't eat green peppers. And I said suspiciously, "What's that?" And my mother was terribly embarrassed once again. Oh. And his wife was awfully nice. She said, "Oh, just try it, and if you don't like it, I'll give you some meat." So I didn't like it, of course, and so she gave me something else, but that was nice, you see. And the other things, the snobbery in Sydney, everyone went to Carl's. That was a restaurant in Castlereagh Street, just near the Theatre Royal was in Castlereagh Street in those, no, it was in, yes, Castlereagh Street. And Carl's had white tablecloths, and the sandwiches had always an olive with them and parsley, and if you had cakes they had a 3-tiered cake stand, all silver. And all my friends, of course, that's when I went to the private school, all went to Carl's, and they just started Reppin's then, run by a Russian, you see, and it was the first coffee shop ever in Sydney, Reppin's. And my mother was delighted, and she said, "No, we go to Reppin's." And I was so upset. I said, "All my friends go to Carl's, they'll think we're poor if we go to Reppin's." And Mother said, of course, "What's wrong with being poor? There's nothing wrong with being poor." And I used to slink behind my mother and think, "I hope my friends don't see me going to the other thing she did, you see, you're supposed to go in the dress circle at the pictures, because it was more expensive than the stalls." And of course my mother, contrary as she was, liked the stalls. So we had to go to the stalls, and I used to slink behind her once again, and she used to darn my stockings, and I thought that was dreadful. I thought my mother was dreadfully difficult, and none of my friends' mothers behaved like she did. Now I'm so grateful to her. She freed me from snobbery, from worrying about what people think, because her idea was, you go by what people are like. If they're nice and you like them, you have the same interests. Doesn't matter where they live, what they do. They could be the street sweeper. You know, you might find an interest. Now, I thought my friends mothers thought my mother was a bit odd. So those are all my memories. But see, I had such a happy time. My mother was a very gentle person, and she hardly she hardly ever got annoyed with me. Once I remember I was terrible. I was arguing and arguing, and she got me mother's shoulder and shook me and said, "You're a little devil." And I was quite shocked. My mother had never said anything nasty like that. The other thing I remember was we had a bedroom on the first floor, and it overlooked a little lane at the back, which had very poor people there, terrace houses. And I remember I used to go down and play with the children because my mother was unusual. She didn't stop me doing things. And they had just had rags on their beds, and it never occurred to me then to think how sad it was, because they were all bright children, you know, there were about 6 of them, they like rabbits, and we used to play together. But I used to think, what an amazing house, you know, it had no furniture and all rags on the beds and things. And this little lane, my bedroom overlooked it, and it had a street lamp that used to shine in my bedroom, and Mother used to say I had to go to bed at 9 or something like that. And I wanted to read, and I was reading books that I shouldn't read, like Edgar Wallace, which was a mystery thing. And I was reading by the street light till 11 o'clock, and then I'd go and stand in the hall. But then I got so nervous I couldn't stay in bed. I imagined there were people behind the doors, and there was a drunk man outside. Did that come in? At a certain time, and I liked reading, so I was reading Edgar Wallace, which my mother didn't like me reading because they were murder stories and things and detectives, and so I'm afraid I used to read them by the street light. And then I knew she always came up to bed about 11 o'clock. So when it got about 10 to 11, I'd suddenly get terribly nervous, and then I'd think there were murderers all around the place, and then I looked out and there was a drunk man outside leaning against the lamppost talking to himself, and somehow there was something very sinister about drunk men to me in those days. So I sort of rushed to the door, and where there was a light in the hall, and I stood there, and then I heard my mother coming upstairs to bed, and in the morning she wondered why I was so tired, because I hadn't gone to sleep till 11. But it's funny, you know, drunk men around the streets, you know, it just, I don't know, Mother never said anything about them. I just felt they were weird, and something about a street light, all a dark lane, and the spotlight on a man just there, it's sort of sinister.
Mm. It sounds that the places that you lived in were very elegant in terms of, we've heard later stories of residentials, but mostly people were living, at the most they would have 2 rooms in which they lived and cooked. But did you and your sister each have a bedroom? And
yes.
And your mother?
Well, my mother had a bedroom, and I had a closed-in veranda off her bedroom, but my sister had a bedroom of her own.
And there was a dining room?
Oh, there was a huge dining room, and I used to like talking to the maids, as they called them, in the afternoons, because everything was so well run there. You got clean sheets twice a week, and clean towels, and the silver was clean that you ate from every single day. The maids used to sit in the kitchen and clean them. They had a lot of staff. And they used to even polish they had the Sheffield steel knives, they used to polish those. And they used to sit at 2 o'clock when they'd washed after lunch. That was their free time, which maid was on duty, and I was friendly with them all. And so I used to go and sit in the kitchen and talk to them, and that's one of my happiest memories. I always remember the sun coming in the kitchen was all quiet, and people were having sleeps, and I was there, and I heard the most amazing things. I learnt a lot from the maids. One of them said to me she lived in McDonaldtown, and I said, where was that? And she said, oh, it's a very poor area, very, very poor, you see. And then she said, when she went out with men, she said, you know how I get money? When we go down to the beach, and when they've taken their trousers off and they the money drops out of their pockets and I take it, you see. And that poor girl, I felt really sad for her because she became pregnant and she got the sack. And she also introduced me to gin. My mother would have died if she'd known what I was doing. She used to sometimes have a little nip of gin in the morning. This made 11 o'clock, and I used to go down to her bedroom and she said to me, have a nip of gin. So I'd have a little nip of gin, and I felt quite wuzzy afterwards, but I didn't drink any more. But I mean, she introduced me to a new sort of life, and the other life was sort of to an elegant life. Now, there was a bachelor, his name was Mr. Doyle, and he had the room in the tower. There was a tower room, and you used to go up these lovely windy stairs, and after we'd all got dressed at 6:30, he used to invite us all up for a sherry or a beer. And my sister was really nice to me. I mean, she was 10 years older, but she and I got on really well. And I used to go up in my... and I used to go up there, and Ingrid used to say, yes, I could have a little sherry. So I used to, and I remember, I didn't say I felt wuzzy. I remember coming downstairs feeling wuzzy too after that. But all the young people used to congregate in Mr. Doyle's room. And he was having an affair with, the boarding house, Kinneil, was run by three women, Irish. They were lovely. And Miss O'Connor was the one who owned it. She had all the money, and her two nieces, Miss Margaret and Miss Betty Gilligan, and they ran it. And Miss Betty used to sit in the office in the morning, and Miss Gilligan used to organise the staff and see the linen was out and there were fresh flowers every day. And, you know, breakfast was always the bell for dressing at 7:30 and breakfast at 8. At 11 o'clock, 11 o'clock there was morning tea served on a tray mobile in the sitting room. In the winter there was a lovely roaring log fire in there. And we had tea and cakes and bread and butter. In those days everyone's terribly fond of bread and butter. If you went out for afternoon tea, you always had to have a piece of bread and butter before you ate the cakes or the biscuits. And then lunch at 1, which was always a very nice lunch, and then afternoon tea was bought also on the train bill in the sitting room, all with silver pots and things like that, and that was cakes and tea, and you had either lemon or cream or milk with the tea. And then at night you had this nice dinner, and after dinner they always served coffee on the tray mobile in the sitting room in little demi tasse cups and elegant china, you know. And I enjoyed all the people in the boarding house because I've always been very sociable. So I used to, and people are often lonely in boarding houses, and I used to go up to an 83-year-old who used to do tatting, which I couldn't even describe what tatting is now, but it's with a little shuttle and like lace it did, and she used to talk to me about her life when she was young. Then I'd go to Bobby O'Sullivan, who was another woman who lived there, and she was only 23 and she was having sad love affairs, so I'd sit and listen to all her love affairs and be all... So I sort of got I've never sort of thought of age. I got a cross-sex, I was friendly with everyone, the maids, the 83-year-old, the 24-year-olds who were having problems. And so it was a lovely sort of life, and there were really interesting people there. There was another barrister lived there. His name was Mr. Woods, and he lived with his sister. And they were, in those days, there weren't many cars, and they were the few people who had a car, and they had a chauffeur. And Mr. Woods saw I did a lot of reading, so he gave me £10, which was a hell of a lot of money to buy whatever books I liked. So I remember I spent a whole week making a list of books, and then I went into Angus and Robertson's and bought them. It was so exciting, you know. And there were so many people there, you know, that were interesting and nice. There were another woman who lived with her mother, and they were very rich. Their names were Pfeiffer, Miss Pfeiffer and Mrs. Pfeiffer, and they had a car with the chauffeur. There was a man that used to zot around Elizabeth Bay in an electric motor car who lived down Billiard Avenue. The Boomerang mouth organ people lived down in a glamorous place on the harbour at Elizabeth Bay. There've just so many people. I still, because I enjoyed myself so much, I still remember their names, you know.
Sounds absolutely magical.
Well, it was. And then, you know, and then that is funny, because then the depression must have been affecting my mother then, because must have been about 1936. It must have taken a long time for it to affect her. 37 even. My sister, no, it was 36. And my sister came one weekend and said to me, I want to take you for a walk, Patty, as she called me, and I said, oh, yes. And we went round all the poorest places round St Vincent's Hospital, and there were men there staggering round who'd been drunk and had bloody bandages, and men with no, you know, legs that probably from the war, and they were drunk people. And I must have been a terribly sensitive child because I was very sheltered. And Ingrid said to me, this is where we'll have to live when we lose our money. And I said to her, are we going to lose our money? And she said, oh yes, I think so. And I came home. Do you know, I realise now, I didn't know then, I must have had what people now call migraine. I came home with this terrible headache. I can still remember it. And I said to my mother, I've got a dreadful headache. And, you know, in those days, my mother didn't take aspirin or anything, and she just said, well, go to bed. And I did. And I went to sleep, and then I suddenly woke up and vomited over the side of the bed without realising. And my poor mother cleaned it all up. After that, I was okay. I slept the rest of the night, but it must have upset me so much that I got a migraine.
You would have been about 16 at that time.
Yes, that's right.
And your older sister would have been 26. Was this year?
Yes, well, I think it actually must have been when I was 14. It must have been 1934. And then we hung out still, I think, without a lot of money, because I remember at times I'd want to go to the pictures, and it was only sixpence to go to the pictures in those days. And I did go to a high school. I remember because my mother said to me, you'll have to go to a high school, and I said, what's that? And she explained to me, very good education, etc. So I went down to William Street High, and then I went on to Sydney High to do the evening. And, you know, in those days, oh yes, and then we went out, you see, to live at Rose Bay, so when I was 16, and that 36, so that must have been when we lost money, because we lived in a much less glamorous boarding house and things. And so yes, obviously all the shares didn't bring in money, because I remember saying, yes, when we left Kinneil, that I was very sad. I was always a very dramatic child, to leave my room with so many dreams in it, and everyone sort of had great difficulty not to laugh. I remember wondering why they laughed.
Well, how long did you live there, at that boarding house?
Oh, from 1928, was it, until 1936.
So you lived there for 8 years at that lovely place.
That's right. And it was lovely, and I mean, it was a home away from home. I remember I had a birthday party, and I was always very inventive, so we had a treasure hunt, and I had all these elegant girls running around the garden, climbing trees. I had little clues everywhere, you know, and then Mother had provided food inside. I mean, they had provided food and everything. And that's a little story, actually, I'd like to tell you, because I'm quite proud of myself, and it was only because of my mother's influence. When I was going to this exclusive school, there was a girl there who lived in White City, behind White City, in one of those rather poor terrace houses, and her parents had saved up to send her
What was the name of the school? What school was that?
This was a preparatory school for Skeggs, and it was called The Glen, and it was in Roslyn Gardens. It was run by an old lady called Miss Neville and her daughter Miss Vivian. And all sorts of interesting people went there. There was a girl called Ruth Osborne, who later on married a cousin of the Queen, and lived in England. And there were Dr. Coghlan lived next to us in Kinneil, and he had a daughter called Joan, and a son Billy, and I've forgotten the other son's name. There were two sons, and they were there, and it was fun in those days. I mean, you were allowed to be an individual in a way, because I remember one day Billy Coghlan got annoyed with Ruth Osborne, and he hit her on the head with a tennis racket, and it didn't hurt. I mean, it was just strings. And we all went home to lunch, and Ruth went home to lunch, and she came back. She had red hair, and she's very attractive, drooping with a big bandage round her head. And she said, "Oh, I'm so ill, and Billy, hit me on the head, and I feel dreadful." And Billy said, but these sort of things went on. I had another friend, Robin Eakin, who was well known. Her father was a doctor up on Darlinghurst Road, and she had three very rich aunts who lived in Maranow, where the fountain is now, the El Alamein fountain. Robin Eakin and her aunts, and I can't remember her aunt's name now, but Dr. Eakin used to, it was in the days of the Razor Gang, and they were all down I thought in Woolloomooloo as well as Surrey Hills, but anyway, he used to go down there and treat them, and they used to say, "Oh, don't hurt him, because that's Dr. Eakin, and he's very good." And Robin's mother was tremendously social, and she used to, was always out. And so Robin was rather neglected at times. Sometimes she'd be sitting in the gutter when I went up to buy my comics at the newsagents, and Robin and I go off and play somewhere. And one day Robin was at school. She eventually went to Doon, which was a very glamorous school in Edgecliff. And they had a headmistress they called Cherry. And Robin came and said she was feeling so ill, and she threw herself on the couch, and Miss Cheriton said to her, "Robin dear, what can I get you?" And Robin said, "All I feel is like a pickled onion." And Miss Cheriton, that was a joke we all laughed about, but when Robin told her, Miss Cheriton said that to her father, he said, "I know Robin's very fond of pickled onions." So they were all sort of it was a little home away from home. I used to go up at 7 o'clock at night when it was dark to get my comic from the newsagents, which was just near William Street there, and wander up there. And so all these characters lived around, that I knew so well, and it was such fun.
Can you remember Morrison's Cake Shop? Can you remember that?
No, probably because I was not interested in cakes ever, or buying cakes, but what I do remember is the Arabian Coffee Shop, and that was where all the artists and musicians and poets and everybody gathered, and it was really cosmopolitan. And then I remember the cafes where Rosalind Norton had all her paintings where, and then there was
Was Rosalind Norton around in the 20s?
She was around in 1930, 38,
Right.
39, because I used to go back and visit all my friends, even though I was living at Neutral Bay then.
Do you mean Rose Bay, do you, or Neutral Bay?
We were at Rose Bay when we were poor, and then when my mother was an inveterate mover, we moved to Neutral Bay because a friend of hers lived there, and we lived over in Shellcove Road. But I used to come back because there was the California Coffee Shop there, and we used to go there. And Mother eventually ended up her life in a place called Grey Eagles there, which is right opposite El Alamein Fountain, where she had a room, and she used to have to go out. She got bed and breakfast and used to go out for her meals. So, but she was very poor then. I didn't realise how poor she was. I was sort of married and I was a thoughtless child, you know. I think she spoilt me a bit, I mean, but not spoilt me. I had to be very polite to people and I was made to be nice to people. But as far as she was concerned, I think because she felt it was a lot to be a single mother and she wanted me to be happy. She always said that, I really want you to be happy.
Was your father ever able to come to Australia to join you, or what happened?
No, we used to write to him and things, but then the government wouldn't have him, and that's why I really blamed the government, as I say, for that. He eventually married a very practical French woman who ran his house beautifully. So, and my mother sort of never married or anything. She had lots of offers. She was a very attractive person. But she just sort of lived for her 2 daughters and things. You know, I realise how lucky I was now. It's a pity when your mother's not alive, you suddenly realise how wonderful they've been. I can see all her unselfishnesses now.
Mm. So when you came here, you were actually born here, went back to Germany and came again when you were 5.
Yes.
And well, how long did it take you to learn English after that threat from your mother about you weren't allowed to speak?
Oh, it was quite quick to learn English, and I liked reading, and I taught myself to read before I went to school from the Beatrix Potter books. Do you know them?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, see, they're so good. They have a picture on one side, and they have one long word in it, like the rabbits were, what's the word for very sleepy? It was a long word. I can remember they'd put a big word in, and I used to read these laboriously, and that's how I taught myself to read and talk English. So.
Soporific.
Soporific, that's right. You're so good. You do know them so well. And then, you know, I'd come out with this long word, yes. So that's how I learnt it. And Ingrid, my sister, you know, she spoke English when she came out here, because Germans learn English when they go to school, but I hadn't been to school, you see. So she spoke English, and in the end she had no accent at all.
Mm. Gosh. Well, we've covered so much. Well, how would you describe, you know, you've talked about your mother. Well, in those days, so presumably if your father remarried, your mother must have got divorced.
Yes.
Was she still socially accepted then, or was that sort of a scandalous thing?
Well, it was a scandalous thing to be divorced. I mean, you always blamed the woman in those days. It was the woman's fault. She couldn't keep her man happy, make him happy. And my mother was a very proud woman, so that I think it was very hard for her. I mean, even my relations mostly were fairly conservative. And also that she had these way out ideas, like going and visit, not having any snobbery at all. You see, her friends who were very conventional, I think she had a lonely life. It was lucky that she read a lot. The people in the boarding house accepted her because she was a very elegant person, a very well-read person, a very cultured person, and also with a lot of dignity and very reserved. So when people are reserved, she didn't ask for people to ask her questions, so they didn't.
Mm. Where did her funding come from? How did she...
Well, my grandmother died in 1926, and she left my mother these shares to live on, so she lived on shares. And that's why, you know, in the Depression she really was poor, but I think an aunt helped then. I don't know, but I know you know, my friends were rather amazed. Sometimes I'd have to say, no, I can't afford to go to the pictures. I didn't like to say that. That's where things are better now. It really was a disgrace to be poor. So my mother must have really felt it, because most of my relations were very well off.
Well, what sort of occupations were they in? What sort of businesses did they have? The family, your mother's
It was
family?
all inherited wealth. I'm afraid they were feudal lords, and my grandmother's people in England had inherited wealth from Charlemagne's time, and the Beckets had inherited wealth too. But and their professions. See, my great-grandfather was a surgeon. My grandfather was a lawyer. A lot of them were judges. It was just their profession. My grandfather hated his profession. He would have liked to have been an actor. He was very clever at miming, singing and dancing. And that's what's better today too, because today he could have given up that law. He said he hated law. You saw the worst side of everyone in law. And he said he would have liked to have been an actor, but I mean, in those days. He was very good at music. He played in a semi-professional orchestra, the Sydney Philharmonia, on the cello. My mother played the piano, and my aunt the cello, and another aunt the violin. They used to have quartets at home, and which people said were really of terribly high standard. And my mother, when she was growing up, she was very musical, and our whole house used to be full of poor Jewish people who were musical and, you know, liked reading and things. Mother was always drawn to people who were keen on music and art and reading. She had some other friends who called the Roberts, who were of Russian Jewish extraction, and they used to lend all their furniture to the local repertory company. So you'd go down to the Roberts and there'd be just a piano and an organ there, and all the sitting room furniture had gone. You know, my mother had liked interesting people. I sort of thought I had a lovely time growing up with musicians and actors and artists and people. But see, then when she came back, they'd all sort of that was when she was young, and then when I was young, that was okay. But gradually, as they got old and poor and things, and they disappeared and things, you know. As I said, she had a hard life.
So did you have people come to your, well, was the family close? You know, your aunts and grandparents and all that?
Yes, her sisters were close. One aunt lived in the country, and she married her first cousin, and they had a property up out of Wellington, New South Wales. And the other aunt she was a real psychological textbook case of somebody who loved their father so much they couldn't marry anyone, so she waited until her father died, and then she married a man old enough to be her father. And they had 8 years of happy life, and then he died. And then an aunt came out from Africa. She'd married a bloke who had a coffee plantation in Africa. She was poor too, you know, because the coffee plantation had failed, and he had to deliver cakes then, and they lived in Dover Heights. And I mean, that was a terrible disgrace for a husband to be delivering cakes. Now I think of it and I talk about it, I'd hate to live in all that snobbery again. But as I said, my mother freed me because she refused to acknowledge that that was a good thing. And she never kowtowed to it, never. I was never allowed to feel embarrassed about anything. And if we had any poor relations, Mother always went to visit them, even if the others didn't.
And when you were living at the various boarding houses, were you able to have the artists' friends and?
Oh yes, they used to come and visit and things like that, and Mother would go out to them and with concerts, because I always remember too, you know, how families are critical often, not immediate families, but the aunts would say, Jean shouldn't be going to all those concerts, she can't really afford it. You know, and Mother felt she'd go mad if she didn't go to concerts and have some sort of a life. I can see now too. yes.
And you know how you were living in the boarding houses and she could spend time with you. Did you spend much time with your mum?
Ah, yes. I was what she called her little companion, and I was always full of daring schemes, so she said I was hard to bring up because I'd do things I didn't think were naughty. Like we went one year to stay, an uncle died and left us some money, and so Mother splurged it on going to Brisbane and staying in a hotel in the middle of Brisbane. And it's some motherly instinct made her wonder why I go to my bedroom in the morning, and it was 6 o'clock and I wasn't in my bed, and she got a terrible shock. And at 7 o'clock she was about to ring the police, and I came back with my sketchbook and paint box and said, "What's the fuss? I've only been down at the river painting the sunrise. I had to go early because the sunrise got up at 6. And Mother said, "That's a terribly naughty thing to do. I've been out of my mind." And I said, but I was all right, you know. I couldn't see anything wrong with that, you know. So, but I was, and we were very close, my mother, sister and I was telling Gerhard, you know, that when we went to the gardens the other day, how very sentimental about the botanical gardens, because Sunday afternoon we'd often walk into town from King's Cross and we'd walk to the gardens, and all round the gardens, my mother, my sister and I, and then always the, treat at the end was to go to the little kiosk for afternoon tea, and that had, very unglamorous these days, it had wooden floors, it was, a real kiosk with round rotunda thing, and it had wooden floors and marble tables, but the ice creams were served in little silver dishes, and Mother always had scones and tea, and Ingrid did too, and I always had an ice cream. And I love walking in the gardens with my mother, and often we'd walk around Elizabeth Bay together at night, Ingrid and Mother and I. Mother was very conscious of the fact you needed exercise every day. I'd sit on my bed and read all day sometimes, and at 4 o'clock she'd come in and say, "Come on, you've got cobwebs in your brain, you have to go out for a walk." And I used to go protesting, but after a while I began to enjoy it.
Mm. Well, with all that food and everything, the meals were good at the...
Oh, yes, they were wonderful food, but I don't know, people didn't seem to get fat in those days, not fat like I see so many people around today. I don't know whether they eat the wrong food or it's the fast foods or what. I really don't know, because my mother was a very tall woman, and she wasn't what you'd call thin. I mean, she was quite well covered when she got to over 60, but she wasn't fat. None of the aunts were fat, and yet they had... But see, they had to walk everywhere. They didn't have cars. It was very unusual, even all these rich people that lived. As I said, there were only 2 or 3 that lived at Kinneil that had a car. It was very unusual. And there couldn't have been much traffic, because my aunt, when she lived at Neutra Bay, used to invite us from Rose Bay right over just for afternoon tea, and that wasn't... I mean, nowadays you wouldn't go all that way just for afternoon tea, but nobody thought anything of it then. We'd catch the tram to Queen Square, and then we'd catch the other tram down to the quay, or walk down to the quay, and then we'd get the boat. And that'd be just... We'd be there at 4 o'clock and leave at, 5 or something. No, we'd be there at 3 and leave at 5. Nobody thought anything of that.
Okay. Was your mother religious?
Oh, they were what you call Unitarians, and that's very interesting, because the Unitarian was an intellectual movement that started in... by a Catholic, Faustus Socinus, and he got fed up with in the 16th century with the Roman Catholics and the Church of England arguing, and he said there's only one God, so it's ridiculous, and he founded this movement called the Unitarians, and the Unitarians did not believe that Christ was the Son of God. They believed he was a good man and a philosopher. But they believed in God, but as a result, no Unitarians were ever christened, so I've never been christened. Oh yes, I was christened, I don't know why, in St John's Church, Darlinghurst. But none of the rest of the family were christened, and my aunt in Wellington, when she was 93, the bishop from Bishop Long from St Andrews, I suppose, came up to Wellington and he said, "I've heard you're not christened. If you like, I'll christen you now." And Aunt Elwyn also had a presence like my mother, and she said, "Bishop, I don't think God's annoyed with me because I'm not christened." So he gave up, he didn't christen her. But the Unitarian Church was in, I've got photos of it. It burnt down. It was in Hyde Park, in that street, Liverpool Street. And it just opposite Hyde Park there, and it was built in 1871. And I've got the silver trowel that my great-grandmother laid the first foundation stone of it. It was burnt down in 1936. I remember my mother being quite sad. So it was really, and the Unitarian religion believed that women were equal to men, so that's why my great-grandmother, they always teased her. It was more, you were allowed to, it was a philosophical movement, although they believed in God.
March 1995, this is take 2. Pat, we're just at the, I think we finished up the last tape talking about the religious upbringing. So how were you raised as a Unitarian?
No, it's rather amusing because my mother, I think, felt that her life was so unusual as a single parent with 2 children that she should bring me up a little bit more conservatively. So she took me to St James Church in King Street. I can't remember the minister's name, but I remember I must have had very definite ideas. I was only about 11, and I remember I looked at him and I listened to what he had to say, and I didn't agree with him. And I said to my mother when I came out, "I don't like him, and he's no better than I am." And I think I had this idolised version of ministers. We're like God, they weren't people. They should be much better than you were. And the other thing that worried me, funnily enough, was that when people got outside the church, they said nasty things about each other, and I thought that was rather dreadful, that they should say things about each other when they should be Christians and not say anything about each other. My mother was somebody who was a very strong character, and if she told me not to do something, she never did it, even in the dark, I mean, I never say, she'd say to you, "Don't pick your nose," or something like that. Well, then I never caught her doing it. So, I mean, she never did anything that she told me not to do. And she was somebody who didn't say things about people. She thought it was waste of energy bitching about people. So I was sort of, I mean, if she didn't like them, she avoided them. But she didn't bother to say things about them. And I think I forgot that I went off the track, if I could just go back, when I was at that very exclusive school, that I was quite proud of myself with this, and was my mother's influence. There was this girl who lived in this very poor house behind the White City, and none of the girls were nice to her because they knew she was poor, and they were not talking to her. And I told my mother, and my mother said, "That is absolutely dreadful." And she said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll invite her to your birthday party, and then they'll have to be nice to her because they all want to come to your birthday party." So that's what we did, and she became my best friend. And I think that was nice, but that was due to my mother, of course. And Joy was, as her name was, Joy, she was so thrilled to come up and be accepted by everyone. But see, that's what it was like, that awful snobbery.
Well, what happened about your trip to St James? Did you convert, or what happened? Did you?
No, my mother, I was so critical of the minister each time she took me that my mother gave up. She found it too exhausting to come home and find I was... but I went through a religious stage. I asked her for a Bible, which rather surprised her, but it was because it had pictures in it. It had Samson, you know, with holding the building, and these lovely stories of Joseph and the coat of many colours and all those things. So I used to read the Bible every night before I went to bed when I was about 14, you know. And I admired Jesus very much. I thought he was a wonderful man because he never said things about people, and he accepted everyone, prostitutes, and he kicked all the money lenders out of the church and everything. I admired him.
What about politics? Did your mother ever discuss politics?
No, that was something that, you know, politics were taboo, really. Mainly, I think, because this aunt of hers who ran the boys' club was so hounded for having a brain that mother was sort of... my grandfather then spent his life trying to get his daughters not to have brains, and as they all did, he had a great trouble. Because women in those days weren't supposed to have brains. That was another awful thing. When I first started going to dances with boys, I sort of said to them, I'd been reading this wonderful book, and one of them said, "Oh God, Pat's a blue stocking." So I spent the whole night sitting against the wall as a wallflower. So then I went through a stage where I didn't read anything for 2 years, and I bought false nails. This was when I was 18, false eyelashes, and I put on lipstick, and I had my hair waved very artificially, and I was what you call a pain in the neck. My mother did not like me at all. She said, "That's dreadful red gash of a mouth you've got." And I talked frivolities, and of course I went out with boys I found terribly boring. And even then, they were going, the ones I met, they were going to be doctors, and I sort of said to them with stars in my eyes, "Oh, how lovely to be able to cure people and the ills of the world." And he looked at me in horror and said, "Don't be silly, I'm going in for the money and the kudos." And so I was completely squashed. So I just felt at that stage I didn't fit in anywhere. That was where it was hard, because my mother was so way out in her ideas, and I was going to Sydney High at that stage, and, you know, I had all these girls home to stay who lived in really poor suburbs and poor houses, and my mother liked them, and she was very friendly with them, and the boys didn't know what to do with me, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So it wasn't easy, you see. When you say privileged life, it wasn't really easy because I didn't fit into any niche.
Yes, yes. And being accepted, or acceptance as a child, is pretty important.
It is. And I was accepted among the friends who came to visit me, but they always used to... they'd all suddenly become terribly well behaved when they came and visited me, because they were sort of surprised at my surroundings, whereas I'd picked them because they'd been the naughtiest girl in the class.
I was going to ask what sort of discipline was used at home.
I was mainly deprived of things, like I wasn't allowed to go to the pictures that week if I'd been naughty, or when I was younger I was not allowed to eat the chocolates I'd been given, or it was always deprivation of something. And also, as I was my mother was always quite genuinely sad that I'd been naughty, and that really shattered me because I was so fond of her. I felt really dreadful that I'd sort of upset her.
Oh. Well, did the family, your mother and your sister and you, do things together for fun? You've mentioned walks in the Botanic Gardens.
Yes, we used to go to plays. There was A.A. Milne was put on, you know, and there was a turret theatre at North Sydney. It had a little turret. It's just up from Luna Park there. It's pulled down now, where they had really nice plays, and we used to go to the concerts. From the age of 11, Mother used to take me to concerts. And I always remember you wore white dress at night, and I wore this lovely, nice white dresses. And we'd go to the concerts in the town hall. And I loved the town hall, those lovely old cedar doors and cedar panelling and the excitement of the chandeliers. And I remember hearing Philip Hargraves play, and he was only 11 and he was a child prodigy. And, you know, that, and our mother used to take me to the Messiah always on Christmas Eve. That was another thing. We had a lot of family rituals, you see, like that. So, and, you know, my mother made things exciting always. Everything was nice. And she said, you know, I wasn't her little companion. And I loved being that.
Mm. Can you remember any of the other concerts or plays that you went to?
There was Lotte Lehmann, who was a German pianist, and I think we used to go to the conservatorium a lot. Those were cheaper, you know, the people were learning. There was Jascha Heifetz, and who was a violinist, and, you know, all the pupils, we'd go to their concerts and things. And then, yes, Mother seemed to know the new musical world. There was a Muir Old, he ran the conservatorium, and I'm forgetting their names now. She also, she had a friend, Kathleen O'Connor, who was married to a well-known musician. Dear, I wish I've forgotten that now. I should have dredged my memory before you arrived. But she, as I say, she knew mostly the musical world in Sydney.
Did you have lessons?
Mother started to teach me, but I was very naughty, and I could remember all the and I wasn't reading the music. And then I didn't want to practice. And I mean, life must have been exhausting for her anyway, so she gave up. If I was very determined about things like that, Mother would give up. I mean, she wanted me to learn tennis, and I said, no, I wasn't going to learn that stupid game.
In the evening, what would you typically do? You would have the dinner at the boarding house?
Yes, well, then we would either we'd go to concerts some nights, and other times we'd read. Everyone read a lot. I remember people used to sit around in the communal sitting room. There'd be a little group playing bridge. Bridge was suddenly very popular. A little group playing bridge. My mother didn't like cards, and she read avidly. She loved biographies. She used to read biographies about all the people. And I read a lot. Mother played the piano herself. Ingrid read a lot. We went to the pictures quite often at night. You know, I grew up in the Hollywood era, and I remember being quite shocked when the hero wasn't handsome, and it was more, the story wasn't all black and white, you know.
Was this even in your school days when you had to get up and go to school in the morning?
I think I probably, no, I don't think I went out at night in the week. It was during the weekend. But 5 o'clock sessions were very popular. I remember walking, the State Theatre was, I used to go, and I remember we used to, friends and I, we used to, if I missed a meal, you see, that's something that the boarding house, you couldn't miss. If you missed a meal, you missed a meal. And Mother didn't always have money for me to go to a restaurant, so friends and I used to buy a Savoy, and we'd eat that and go to the 5 o'clock session. I remember the State Theatre had these wrought iron doors, and sometimes we used to peer at the films through these wrought iron doors. And the State Theatre, I thought, was a very glamorous place. And then there was the Prince Edward, which was opposite the Australia Hotel, and that always had beautiful fountains and flowers in the in the foyer. And but at nights, as I say, it'd be mostly reading or music or talking. We'd sit around and talk quite often.
And were there any theatres or picture theatres or?
Yes, we went to the Theatre Royal. Oh, at King's Cross.
Yeah.
Not in those times. Later there was the Minerva, which was in was it Orwell Street, or one of those little streets off Reclay Street. That was the Minerva Picture Theatre. But there was you had to go into town mostly. It was no problem to go in town because we were so close.
You know how you say that life was hard for you. Well, the next question is can you describe your mother's working day? So, but your mother lived on the income from shares,
Yeah.
dividends. But did she, well, when you were at school or whatever, did she do any kind of work? I mean, a lot of well-off women in those days would do charity work, or what were her interests?
Well, I suppose you could say that she was what today you'd think perhaps it was a selfish life, but it wasn't really, because I was only away from 9 till 3 each day, and I mean, my mother wasn't a well woman because she'd had a nervous breakdown. Nobody knew about nervous breakdowns in those days, but she never took it out on me. But it evidenced itself in the fact that she was very slow at doing everything. You know, it took her a long time to get dressed, and I think, you know, music was her self-preservation. If she felt nervy, she'd go to a concert or things. And then she'd go for walks, and she'd read. She'd read a lot. It was an escape. And of course, if you live in a boarding house, you're never really alone. So there were people to talk to, and there were quite interesting people there. And so that she didn't. And when we lived at Rose Bay, my sister was married and she lived a block away, so my mother used to go down nearly every day to be with her and things. But life seemed very leisurely in those days, because when my sister got married, I always remember she used to do the housework in the morning, and she'd make the pudding, say, for that night's dinner, and prepare the vegetables, and then she'd go in the afternoon. I often went with her, either visiting friends or to a film. She often went to a 2 o'clock session. She'd be home at 5 o'clock for her husband to cook the meal and things like that. And I remember Sunday mornings, we all used to sit on the steps and read the Sunday papers. It was sort of the whole morning. It was really before lunch, and you had a big lunch, and then people slept in the afternoon in those days. And
was this when you were at Rose Bay?
Yes, and Elizabeth Bay, we'd read the papers in the morning. Sunday morning was a real, you know, rest day, to read the papers and have a big lunch and have a sleep in the afternoon.
Did the maids at where you were staying, did they make your beds and clean your rooms? And
Yes, yes.
Hmm.
They used to turn down the beds at night before. They came up when you were having dinner and took the bedspreads off and turned down the sheets and put out your pyjamas on the pillow.
God. My life was good.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. What effect did the First World War have on your father?
Well, he was not a warlike sort of person. He was a very artistic person. I mean, he was very good at wood carving. He was a marvellous artist. And he was a marvellous photographer. In the end, he kept us by his photography for, you know, good magazines like Casno here and things like that. But when he and my mother first married, they had a wonderful life. All they did was play music. She played the piano, he sang, he played the piano. They used to collect antiques and have dinner parties and go to concerts and things like that. And she had a nurse for my sister and a maid and a cook too. So they didn't have he didn't have a lot doing. They led what I'd call a very intellectual life. It was all music and reading and talking philosophy with people they met, you know, and things like that. So, and then when the war came, and he was being the eldest son, he was in the army anyway, because they always, you know, in the royal family, they always had to be in the army, and he...
What royal family was he a part of? What was the name of it?
Part of the Hohenzollerns, the castles up there. We lived in Freiburg, which is the Hohenzollern castle, all looked down on us, and we looked down the town. And after the war...
You lived in the castle?
After the war, we lived not in that castle, in a castle in Rastatt, which had secret passages and everything, but it was a rundown castle. I've got a photo I can show you of the castle my father was born in with a tower. It looks all run down now too, because you see the royal family didn't have money then after that, and they couldn't give him money. So he had to bring up his family after the war on no money, and so he did it by his photography. And I was a reconciliation, actually, and the last thing he wanted was a little baby. I mean, the reconciliation night must have been nice, and the arrival of the baby, and I think that's what my mother always felt was dreadful, that my father didn't want me, of course, but I can understand why he didn't. And because when he was away for a whole 12 months, and he was an intellectual. He could see what the war was doing to people and how bad it was. And he, when he came back, he was shell-shocked, and nobody knew what shell-shock was. And he had these dreadful rages, and I remember my mother always felt that I shouldn't be exposed to loud voices and yelling and screaming and going on. So it was the only time I was allowed to look at his really good art books. I was put in his study with the door shut and looking at art books while my father screamed at the top of his voice. And you know, he was really in a bad way, and my mother... and they'd been very much in love, and nobody understood anything. I'm a very open person. I hope you don't mind if I talk about sex, because I was going to say that my mother said that when they were together that he made love to her nearly every night, which she enjoyed. And when he came back, he didn't want to touch her. And she was so innocent, she didn't know why. And years after, she said to me, "Did I know what impotent meant?" And I said, "Oh, yes," and I proceeded to tell her, and her eyes got bigger and bigger, and she said, "I think that must have been your father." And I said, "Oh, probably." I thought, "You poor thing, you know, she felt reviled and not wanted." And in those days, if a woman didn't make her husband happy, it was her fault. And he probably felt it was her fault too. He was a spoilt older son. And he was probably, you know, "Why can't you run the house?" and things. But years after, I'm glad, he wrote her a letter and said, "I must have been mad." And, you know, and she had a nervous breakdown here, and nobody knew what nervous breakdowns were. She got that she couldn't do anything.
When was that?
That was, I think... 1931 it was. Whether he got married then or what, I don't know. But then, and she was probably going through change of life and couldn't cope. And I realise now she'd had a nervous breakdown, and she never took anything out on me. So I just went to boarding school, and I came home for the weekends. I didn't mind boarding school, but I didn't like it.
What school was that?
That was called Dalcross. It was at Pymble. It was a preparatory school for PLC. And I can still remember all those girls' names too. But I always enjoyed people. I was lucky, so I enjoyed the girls. But I realise now, because I remember once when seeing my mother in those days they had chambers. You know, the maids used to have to empty people's chamber pots in the morning. No one emptied them. And mother, I remember it was full of blood, and I wondered why, you know, and she was awfully nervy. But
was this at 1931?
Yeah.
Mm.
And I remember, you know, wondering why she sent me to boarding school, and some weekends she couldn't have me because she wasn't feeling well, and I remember crying over the phone, and why can't you have me? You know, I want to come home. I love you, Mummy. I was always rushing to her and hugging her and, you know, saying, I do love you. But you see, I can remember leaving Germany too, and the trip in the train, and it was so hot, and Mother was very nervy, and I had to share a bed with her because we didn't have as much money then as all that. And my sister, in the end, my sister said she'd have me in the bed, and I slept better because Mother must have been restless, I was too. And then we picked up the ship at Italy, and I remember standing on the deck with my mother, and the Mount Etna was emitting sparks. And I said, oh, I'm so frightened, what's that? And she said, oh, it's only the volcano letting a few sparks out and things. She was always very reassuring. And so, you know, and I can remember coming here. But as I say, my father was had this awful breakdown.
Mm. Can you remember when you were in Australia seeing, especially you talk about, you know, your room overlooking the lanes, and that you roamed around the cross and all those areas quite extensively. Can you remember seeing people who are obviously veterans, men who are obviously veterans from the First World War?
Oh yes, they were everywhere, in the trams, and they'd have one leg with their trousers tucked over it, just the stump, and one arm, and that day when my sister took me around St Vincent's, they were all still going to the hospital for their war wounds and things like that. They were everywhere, all around the city, and a lot of them were street people, you know, who had no job because they were a cripple or they'd lost a leg or something, or an arm, and they'd be singing in the street. I always remember all of them with the hat in front of them. And Mother would always say, you know, they are men from the First World War, isn't that sad?
What was the public attitude, or sort of society's attitude, if you could use such a general term, toward the injured veterans, the ones who, you know, were conspicuous and obviously weren't coping with life?
I would say that people who had compassion felt really sorry for them. They were never considered, people felt that their lives had been ruined by the war, and they were never well off. They were always poor, and they couldn't get jobs, and their whole life was disrupted, and so people were inclined to say compassionately, oh, the poor soul, he was a soldier in the war and he lost his leg and he hasn't got a job and he's poor. And you got the impression that everyone was poor because they'd been in the war. And, well, the people I mixed with felt compassion for them. They didn't feel they were failures. They felt they'd made the supreme sacrifice, really, and therefore that their lives were horrible. And I sort of... you know, but they didn't themselves. I think they didn't feel good. I didn't think they felt they were men, because I think, you know, there was always that...
Part 2 of the interview with Pat Rose. It's the 9th of March 1995. Pat, in King's Cross, when you were living there in the 20s and 30s, were there many kids in the neighbourhood?
Yes, there were families, the family next door to us and people down the street. Yes, there were lots of kids. And all the kids I went to school with lived around me. Yes, lots of us. And that's why we used to wander around at night, you know, but not like street kids today somehow. I mean, we went homeless and we went feeling frustrated with life. It was just summer nights and the stars and the beaches, the harbour, you know, it was all just nice, and leafy suburbs, and it was very safe in those days. I think I've said that before. Yeah.
Was it a good place for kids to grow up in?
Yes, because there was so much space. I mean, well, our garden was huge, and also because you could wander around freely, well, you had all the parks, and you walked down the parks and you paddled in the harbour. And I think that's wonderful. I think kids who can't wander around and paddle in the harbour and take their shoes and socks off, I think they've missed something.
So who were your friends?
Who? Well, when I went to the private school, Ruth Osborne was my friend, the redhead, who was temperamental, and Eve Raymond, the one whose brother went out in the bath, and Christine, whose mother ran the boarding house in Bayswater Road, Christine Wager. They were my friends. Then when I went to high school, I had a friend called Dawn Fitzsimmons and another one called Betty, Betty Wright, I think she was. She lived over at Cogra. I used to have to go miles to visit them, and they came miles to visit me.
What high school did you go to?
At Sydney High.
And you were free to travel on the trains and to go all over the city to meet your friends?
Yes, Mother didn't say anything. Well, I'm rather amazed that when my mother grew up in Sydney, she was born in 1882, and they travelled in the trains when she was growing up, and they were all safe then too. I mean, she and her sisters all went to concerts at night and came home. And they lived at Ashfield in those days.
Well, when you say, thinking back to when you were 6 to 8 or to 12, you know, in your pre-adolescent days, what sort of things would you do with your friends?
Well, funnily enough, we played games they don't play now. I can remember every afternoon after school we played chasings and hide and seek. And at birthday parties we played oranges and lemons, which nobody would know these days, where you all join hands and you sing oranges, lemons, the bells of Clemens, because we're all brought up on the English tradition in those days.
And where would you play hide and seek? Whereabouts?
Oh, well, in the garden, and we used to hide, and in the house if it was a wet day. Oh, no, not in the house, in the boarding house. In the garden it was always. I remember playing chasings and hidings in the garden, yes.
Well, how else did you spend your time?
I read a tremendous amount. I used to curl up on my bed or sit in a tree sometimes and read, or take an apple up a tree and a book and read. I did a tremendous amount of reading, and swimming always in the summer. We went to Bondi in the weekends and swam in the Rushcutters Bay baths after school, and just walking. We used to do a lot of walking.
Was the harbour clean enough to swim in?
Yes, the harbour was wonderful. It was so clean, it was beautiful. You could see all the water was crystal. You could see the green seaweed lapping backwards and forwards, and little fish, and the sand was golden. It was beautiful. Yes.
It's hard to imagine.
Well, it is. I resent the fact it's not clean anymore, because you could swim all the way from, at low tide, we used to walk from Rushcutters Bay right round to Rose Bay, all by the rocks, and we used to swim all along the way. We didn't seem to worry about sharks. There were no shark nets on that side. They had a little beach called Lady Martin's Beach, which is at Rose Bay, and that there was that I think is a nude beach now, but of course it wasn't then. And we had scavenger hunts. I don't know whether I told that story about going into the. We were asked to get a policeman's hat and a horse's hair, so I went into the police station at Rose Bay, and they were all very jolly, but they didn't lend us a hat. And we couldn't find a horse, but we used to gallop around Rose Bay, you know, looking for things like that. An old tram ticket, a horse's hair, a policeman's hat, something else, you know, and you had to come back with them all.
Who would organise that?
Oh, my friends and I.
So it would just be a game?
Oh, just a game, yes. When we were bored, we'd say, let's have a scavenger hunt.
Sounds like fun.
It was fun, yes. I think it's the freedom that I felt very much was the fun. The freedom just to wander around and do all these things. You didn't have freedom at school. It was very stuffy. My cousins went to Sydney High, and that's next to the girls' school at Moore Park, and they weren't allowed to talk to me at the bus stop because you didn't talk to boys. And so if they saw me at the bus stop, they looked the other way and I looked the other way, and we waited till we got in the tram and then we talked, but not in school uniform outside the school. Really funny. And the girls who were naughty used to go and throw little notes over the fence to the boys.
Can you remember any adventures that you had?
Well, I told you about one, going into the house at night and thinking there was a ghost there, and I can't sort of remember it. Just those sort of things, frights you got like that, and reading murder stories and not thinking they were hearing noises in the house and things. Oh, and the one thing, because we always lived in a large house, the bedrooms were always a long way from the sitting room, so when I was 8 and 9, I was nervous at night. But see, you didn't tell your mother. She would have been most understanding. So when I was much younger, I did tell her, and she used to come up and sit with me sometimes and things like that. But I loved, the main thing I've always loved is lying in bed and hearing grown-ups' voices in the distance. You can't hear what they say, but you can know there's people there.
Was your mother's bedroom near yours or next door, and your sisters? Were they adjoining? Or
yes, my mother's, we were in the same hall, yes. But it was only that I went to bed so much earlier because I was 10 years younger than my sister. And so I was always in bed early, but we were all close, our bedrooms were close. But they didn't come up till 11 o'clock at night, you see.
Did you have toys?
Oh yes, I had a doll's house. I loved my doll's house very much, and I had dolls I brought out from Germany with me, and but that was when I was younger. When I was older, say over about 10 or 11, I mainly read and played games like chasings and things like that. Toys. You know, books were the main things I always asked for. I collected books. I collected all the Beatrix Potter series. I collected the May Gibbs series. I collected the Ida Rental Uthwaite series. That was my thing, to get the... And then when I was older, of course, I loved Ethel Turner and Mary Grant Bruce and Anne of Green Gables. I thought was wonderful. And Pollyanna, who I drove everybody mad. Yes, I know, I was a pain in the neck. I always thought I'd like to be like Pollyanna, so I was always cheerful at one stage.
Well, well, how far did you roam when you were with your friends?
Well, as I said, we'd during the day, not at night, we'd walk from Rushcutters Bay to Rose Bay. We didn't go further than that.
Mm.
But that was 3 bays. That was Rushcutters Bay and Double Bay and Rose Bay, 3 bays, but round the rocks.
Mm. And would you go, I mean, that's along the beach. What about inland? Would you go over Darlinghurst, Surrey Hills that way?
No, the Razor Gang was very much in evidence when I was growing up, and sounds funny, but they didn't come out of Surrey Hills, and nobody went down there. I used to peer down the streets with rather delight, I'd think, oh, that's very exciting, the Razor Gang's down there, etc. But you never saw them and round the streets. And as I said, I walked down William Street to town, and I walked on the car side, which was always the left-hand side when you were going to town, and the other one were the cheap restaurants, and where there are a lot of poor-looking people around. And I didn't go on that side. I was a bit nervous. I thought, well,
What was I going to say? Everyone talks about these razor gangs, but they're just sort of these dark, shadowy figures in my mind. I mean, were they young men or were they old men? I mean, who?
I think they were young men, and I think it was the Depression, and I think they were very wild and against society. And as I said, I had a friend, Robin Eakin, whose father was a doctor, and he understood them, and he went down and treated them for nothing, because he said they were really very poor and they had no jobs. And I suppose they robbed each other and robbed anyone who ventured down there. And they went, well, you said that somebody said they went in Woolloomooloo. I refute that, actually, because the ships used to come into Woolloomooloo, and they used to go down and rob the sailors when they were drunk and things like that. And there were a few murders. And the other thing, I remember there were murders in Centennial Park in those days, and there was a young girl, she was strangled with a stocking and her body was in the pond. That gave me the horrors. I used to read all these things, and you got a sort of vicarious excitement about them, You'd think, oh, isn't that awful? But you felt secure in your own house, so that was just a bit of excitement.
Did you ever go over to Centennial Park? Was it a place where you would visit, like you went to the Botanical Gardens?
You see, not many people had cars until 1930. They only started, even in 1936, it was only a few people who had cars. So Centennial Park was a bit out of our field, and so you did keep, mainly just round the bays and Neutral Bay, because I had an aunt at Neutral Bay, so we went over in the boat. And over the North Shore line, because I remember when they were building this is going back now, when they were building the bridge, and there was an awful lot of controversy about it, because everyone said, oh, it's going to ruin the harbour. And I always took the opposite view to everyone else. I must have been a dreadful child. And I said, oh no, it'd be wonderful, wonderful. But
why did they say it would ruin the harbour?
Oh, because it cut the whole harbour in front. In half, Before that, they had a punt or a ferry over to Milson's Point. That's how you visited people up the North Shore line. And a ferry over there and Milson's Point, and you got a train at Milson's Point. And North Shore line people were very much in the bush, and it was a very new area.
Mm. Were there any places that you were not allowed to go as a child, where you were told you're not to go there?
Oh, well, I was not allowed to go down to Surrey Hills, and I wouldn't have been allowed to go into town at night on my own. I was to keep in my own district at night, which was just around King's Cross, where I bought my comics. And I would say Bayswater Road was the cutting off point at night. You went along Darlinghurst Road, but no further than Bayswater Road, but all round the Elizabeth Bay parks and was okay. We didn't go down to Rushcutters Bay Park at night, now I think of that, so I probably was told not to go down there at night.
But how old were you that you were allowed to be out in the streets at night?
I wasn't on my own. I'd had two big boy cousins with me and a smaller boy cousin and a girl cousin. There were four of them and one of me, five of us.
Did they live near you?
Yes, they lived in a boarding house in Billiard Avenue.
Hmm.
Yes. And then they had a flat for a while in Maclay Street. So we had fun. Our mothers used to sit inside and talk, and we were awfully lively and very restless, and we were raced around the streets. Or
How old were you at that age?
Oh, 14, 15.
Mm. What about when you were younger?
When I was younger I wasn't allowed out. That's mainly, I remember when I was 14, 15 and I had these cousins. And also when I was 12, Christine's mother was fairly lenient too, the one who owned Belvedere, it was called, very elegant boarding house in Bayswater Road. Christine's mother let her wander around at night too, but you see, it was, nobody thought of anything happening to you as long as you kept in one area. I think what's made it for a lot of violence, not violence, is that people can get away when they've got cars. In those days, they didn't go far from their area because they'd get caught. They'd have to run on their own feet. I mean, they had none of us had cars, so there were no getaways. Mm. And you knew most of the people. I mean, when I went up to get up to the newsagents in, was just near Bayswater Road to get comics and things. People would say, "Oh, hello, Patricia." People called me Patricia in those days. "How are you?" and "How's your mother?" and things like that. So.
So you'd have dinner and then maybe go out for a couple of hours after to about 9 o'clock or something like that.
It was probably more like 8 o'clock. I mean, dinner would be over about 7:30 or so, and then it would probably be till 8 o'clock or 8:30. Not as late. I think I was in bed by about 9, which seems amazing. I think everyone goes to bed much later these days.
Mm. Were there any people that you had to avoid?
You mean nasty people? What, do you mean that my mother asked me not to avoid?
Yes, to people that are in the area that you were to keep away from.
No, because Mother was not a critical person, and if she didn't have anything in common with people, she just said good day and how are you, but she wasn't friendly with them, and I just made my friends of my own age, and the people in the boarding house, of course, as I said, were all ages from 80 down to 22, and they were my friends. I talked to them, and the maids. See, my mother never stopped me sitting and talking to the maids for hours.
Can you remember any local characters?
Yes, there was Arthur, who used to write eternity on the footpaths, which was very interesting. And then there were, you heard about these characters, like there was Tilly Devine, and there was another prostitute, Kate
Lee.
Oh, Kate Lee, that's right, yes. So we heard about them, and then there was Rosalie Norton. Now you queried that, but I think, that was in the war, about 1941. I became aware of Rosalie Norton, and because then I was, 38, you see, I met a crowd of people, and one of them was a journalist, Noni Belkey-Peterson. Her father ran the gym in George Street. It was Belkey-Peterson had come out from Denmark, and it was very unusual to have a gym. It was not a massage parlour, it was a straight-out gym. And Noni I became very friendly with. She was very beautiful, tall, with beautiful teeth and a Danish skin. And she became a journalist, and she couldn't get on with her family, so she got herself a flat at the age of 18, and she didn't have enough money to put on electricity, so we had candles at night when I went there to dinner, and she had managed to get a bed from somebody, but she had no furniture, so we used to have dinner on packing cases by candlelight. And Noni introduced me to Gavin Greenlees, who was a well-known journalist. Some of the Greenlees, I think, are still alive. And there was Bryden Brown, who was also a journalist. They were quite well known. And they told us about Rosalie Norton. And of course her pictures were around the coffee shops.
On the walls?
Yes, yes. Because somebody said they could introduce me to Rosalie Norton, and I was a bit nervous because I heard she had black masses. And Mother didn't know all that. I mean, Mother would have probably said, no, I mustn't go round with Rosalie Norton. And she wasn't too keen on me going round with the journalists, but she felt at 18 I was a bit hard to cope with. And I said, you know, my friends, and Noni goes round with them. So.
Did you know Arthur Stace?
Oh, yeah, Arthur Stace, yes, because afterwards I became a social worker and I worked at the Red Cross, and Arthur Stace used to come in there. There were a lot of characters around Sydney in those days. There was one who used to have an umbrella up in the waiting room when it was sunny, and he used to have an alarm clock when it was raining on his lap. And then a lot of the poor old things used to really smell high. I don't think they'd bathed or washed their clothes in years, and you could smell them coming down the hall, but we were awfully fond of them. Sydney was full of characters in those days. There were people who, like there's one now, I think, the people who trundled around all their clothes in barrows and
what can you tell me, going back to Arthur Stace, what can you tell me about him?
Just that he was a very gentle old man, and I really don't know why he went round writing eternity. I didn't inquire, funnily enough, in those days. I can't tell you anything else about him, it's a shame.
Why did he come to the Red Cross?
For clothing, and when he was cold, and sometimes if he had no money and things.
Was he derelict?
Yes. We used to hand out, we used to hand out clothes and food coupons and things at the Red Cross.
That would have been in the 40s, the early 40s, because you were an adult by then.
No, it was later then. It was actually, I wasn't living at the Cross then.
Oh.
No, sorry if I've gone off the field.
What years?
That was 50s.
Right. Can you think of any other characters around the Cross when you were a child in the 20s and 30s?
Well, there were lots of musicians and poets that went to the Arabian coffee shop, and artists and people like that. And there were, just trying to think, she ran the Polish ballet school in Forbes Street. Oh dear, and I should have thought of this before. Peggy somebody, I knew it just a while ago, now I've forgotten her name, but she ran the Polish Australian Ballet School, and different people went there, and there was a little playhouse, Brian's Playhouse in Forbes Street. There we went up those stone steps, and they were in that little lane, and they had their studios there, and they put on plays. There were a lot of little theatres around, and unfortunately I just can't remember the names of the people because they weren't well known. They were all struggling artists and poets and people like that, and I used to sit and listen to them.
What can you tell me? I've heard about this Arabian coffee shop. What can you tell me about it?
Well, it was very unusual because coffee shops I think repins must have been started in Sydney then by the Russian, and I think the Arabian coffee shop followed on, because Australians didn't have coffee shops, it came from Europe. And the Arabian was tiny, and it used to fill up very quickly, and we'd all be sitting on top of each other, and everybody knew each other. And they'd be talking music and poetry and art, and they were all people who were wanting to get known and things.
Did you go there when you were sort of adolescent?
Yes, I went there when I was in about 1937, when I was 17, 18.
And would people read their poetry and
yes,
that kind of thing?
and read their poetry and talk about what they're writing, and artists, and they'd have art around the walls. And I mean, I didn't. They'd stay till midnight and things talking. I didn't, of course. I wasn't. My mother had some control over me, so I wasn't out late then.
Sounds very bohemian.
It was very bohemian. I think Norman Lindsay even went there, somebody said. Oh no, he must have been too old. I can't remember now, but I thought somebody said he did. But it was very bohemian, very arty round, and there were weird characters walking later on, at that time, round the cross. But I mean, it was only after the war that it got really a bit dicey with all the sex shops and things. There was nothing like that when I was growing up.
Let's talk about your school days.
Yeah.
In your primary years, where did you go to school?
Well, I went to Skeggs, and then I went to the that other called the Glen, the one in Elizabeth Bay, which was a preparatory school for the schools that you went to if you were in the eastern suburbs, were Kambala, Ashcombe, and Skeggs. And so that was a preparatory school for those schools, and most of those girls went on. I was in the Girl Guides there, and there were Robin Eakin was in that, and there was also the governor's daughter, Rosemary Game, Sir Philip Game. So she went there, and we, the usual guide stuff and things. I got badges and things for swimming and.
Did most of the local kids go to that school?
Yes, they were. I've got a photo of them, and the ones that all lived round me did. So that, and we used to go home for lunch, all of us.
Would you say, how would you say the teachers treated you?
The teachers were all okay. I think we're all quite spoilt rich kids, to be honest, and I think so we got away with an awful lot, to be honest. And we had nice plays every year. I wasn't a good actress, and but everyone had a part. They had, and Winona, where my niece went, they had a whole day of plays at the Independent Theatre, and and each class put on a play. So the parents sat from 10 in the morning till 4, watching the plays.
That must have been fun. Were you happy at the schools? Were your school days happy days?
I was very sociable always, so I loved all the girls and things. So yes, I quite enjoyed school, but I didn't work. And when the last years at Sydney High, I didn't do too well because my mother, that was one thing she was old-fashioned in. She wanted me to have a good time, and she said, well, if you don't do too well, it doesn't matter because you'll get married, which... And that makes her sound awful, but it was the sort of thinking of that day. And the boys, I think I told you, the boys didn't like it if you were brainy. I mean, the first dance I went to, all the Cranbrook and Scots College boys were there, and they were all going to be doctors and lawyers, and they were quite horrified when I talked about reading heavy books and things, and I mean, you made to feel dreadful.
Mm.
Women were very pushed down then. The boys were very much, you know, they would have the careers and...
I'm going to ask you now about sex education. You know, was there any either at home or at school?
No, my mother was far more no sex education at school, and my mother was very innocent about sex because I had to bring her up, because my sister being 10 years older than I was, and she having lived in Europe until she was 15, was a very natural sort of person, and she was the one who told me all about everything, and I used to tell my mother, and my mother used to look at me with big eyes and say, really? I mean, she'd never heard of homosexuality, my mother, and my sister and I never saw any of our families with nothing on, so I remember when Ingrid used to buy, we used to all peer in the art gallery, you know, and look for wonder what was under the fig leaves and things like that, you know. And then I remember Ingrid found a magazine, that was my sister, with pubic hair and bosoms, and she started drawing them. I think we were very frustrated, you know, because I remember sharing a room with my mother once, and she said, turn my face to the wall while she got dressed, and I sort of sneaked round to have a look, and I got into trouble. And then I remember once one of my cousins was staying, and I peered through the keyhole when he was in the bathroom, and I got caught. I always got caught, and I got into trouble for that.
Gosh, did you feel guilty and terrible?
Oh yes, terrible. Yes, oh yes, that was terrible. But there was a very unhealthy attitude towards sex in those days, not with my mother because she was so innocent, but I remember there was a boy there when I was about 12 or 13. I was still a tomboy. I was still at the stage of climbing trees, and a boy came with his mother to stay there, and I was always desperate for company. I loved company, and one afternoon, I found he was good at climbing trees, so every afternoon I used to go up and bang on his bedroom door and say, come down and climb trees. And one old lady in the boarding house complained to my mother, you know, that I was chasing this boy, and I was far too old, the age of, must have been 13 to be going on like that. And my mother thought it was silly, but unfortunately the woman said it in front of me, and that really destroyed an innocence at me at that stage. I then gave up being very natural, and I then got very shy of boys.
It's disappointing, isn't it?
It was, yes, very, because I was very natural, and after that then I got terribly shy with them.
Okay. Well, what was the average family size of your family?
2 children, I would say, mostly. Most of my friends only had brother or sister.
If you're going to talk about the neighbourhood generally at King's Cross, how would you describe it? Was it
a village? It was a village. They looked on it as a village in those days. And you know, men, not the women, but the men, if they want to buy the newspaper on a Sunday morning, they'd walk up in their silk dressing gowns and over their pyjamas and their slippers to buy the Sunday paper on a Sunday.
Really?
Yes.
What was the ethnic mix?
All English or Australian or Irish, you know. You don't, it was only after the war that we got the Europeans out here. That's why the food was very bad, really. I remember going to a dance at the Trocadero when I was 18. It was supposed to be a very glamorous dance, and my mother paid a lot for the tickets, and I went with a boy my cousin, and I remember I was so disappointed with the supper. It had beetroot with no sauce and just a lettuce leaf and a piece of ham, and this was at a very expensive dance. The food was very bad, and mostly, and there were the Arabian shop was the only coffee shop, and as
in the 20s and early 30s.
they mostly didn't meet out. They met in their own houses. It were people had people to dinner or. Well, no, funnily enough, not so much to dinner. People didn't. They had at Christmas and birthdays, but they had people to afternoon tea. Afternoon tea was a big thing in those days. Cakes always, and there was a protocol about afternoon tea. You had a plate of bread and butter, however rich you were, biscuits and cakes. And you started off with a piece of bread and butter, then you had a biscuit, and then you could get on to the cakes.
And would the whole family go, husbands, wives and children, or would it be a ladies and children's sort of event?
Afternoon tea was always ladies and children. I think men and women led very different lives, and then well, you see, it's hard for me to say, but because my mother was a single parent. I mean, I was my sister and I went out, and a lot of and mother would visit. Well, we would go out to dinner and the husbands would be there, that's true. But the husbands seemed to lead their own lives quite a lot. I mean, they'd go off to they had smoking rooms for men in those days. I mean, they'd have dinner and then they'd all go and sit in the smoking room, the men, after dinner. And the women would sit and chat and the men had come back for supper. I don't know why people went fat, because they, like if you went to a play or a concert, there was always a silver pot of coffee waiting for you and chicken sandwiches when you came back to have before you went to bed. And yes, they coffee didn't seem to keep them awake, I don't know.
And when people would have supper later, would they have that after they'd had, you know, a 3-course meal including dessert, and then later on they would still have supper?
Yes, because you see, I think they did a hell of a lot of walking. Like if you went to, when we went to the Theatre Royal, say now the ballet, we're very keen on the ballet, and the Ballet de Russe came out here and from Russia. And you'd go there, you'd have dinner at 7 and you'd be finished say past, and you'd go to town and be at the theatre at 8 o'clock, and it'd finish at about 11, and then you'd come home in the tram.
I was going to say, how did you get around? Did you walk a lot, or what were the sort of, or were there horses? Horse and carriage?
No, that was when I lived at Roseville. There were horses and carriages, and my son absolutely was amazed. He said, I can't imagine you having a horse and going in a horse and a carriage. But at Roseville Station, to meet the train, there was a bloke with a horse and a carriage, and he waited for the trains, and then he took you to home. But in my King's Cross days, there were trams which went into town, and in those days, Queen Victoria was in the middle of. By St James Church there were Hyde Park Barracks and St James Church, and Queen Victoria was in the middle, and the trams used to go in a circle round her, and that's where you caught them to go home to Elizabeth Bay or Rose Bay further out. And later on they decided that trams weren't fast enough, so they had trolley buses which went on cables down William Street, I remember, and up College Street, but they didn't end. In the end, they went back to the trams. So when you were in the east suburbs, you caught a tram to Queen Victoria Square, it was called, and you got out there, and then you walked down to Elizabeth Street and caught another tram down to the quay if you wanted to. So it took you a lot of time getting around places. You did a lot of walking.
I mean, your family was fairly affluent. Sorry. So wouldn't they use cabs? I mean, did they use trams a lot?
No, people didn't use cabs even if they were affluent. If they didn't have a car, you didn't see many cabs. There weren't many cabs around. They were unusual because, you see, there weren't many cars, so they wouldn't have cabs. There weren't many cars. I mean, in 1936, when someone I know married a car salesman, she was very unusual to have a car.
Okay. Where did most people work?
In town. They all worked in town.
And what sort of professions?
Well, my family were all in the law, and I presume the other professions were accountants and people in the bank. Yes, accountants, people in the bank, all office jobs and things like that.
Were you aware, I've been told that King's Cross was quite a mixed area in terms of that, and you've said yourself that over the back from the boarding house, the Belvedere where you lived, there was...
Not the Belvedere, Kinneil was where I lived.
Oh.
Kinneil. Belvedere belonged to my friend in Bayswater Road.
Oh.
Friend's parents, yes.
Oh, right. What was it?
Kinneil.
Kinneil. At the
Yes.
back of Kinneil, there were working class housing there.
Well, it wasn't even working class. It was really pathetically poor. As I said to you, I was amazed they didn't have any bedclothes and hardly any furniture. They were really poverty-stricken, and they had a lot of children.
So where did those sort of people work?
Well, I don't know. You see, I suppose they worked in street sweepers and dead-end jobs, or maybe they didn't have jobs. I didn't sort of inquire into things like that. I mean, I felt the children were all so lively that it never occurred to me they mightn't have a happy time. I mean, I used to play in the back garden with them, and there'd be about 9 or 10 of them, and they'd all be climbing over everything and all over the place, and so it never occurred to me they weren't happy.
What were the main businesses in the area?
Well, there were shops. There were no businesses round the cross, and they were all the car sales places on the left-hand side
Of William Street?
Yes, and then there were pawn shops all on the right-hand side. I still remember the 3 golden balls hanging out, and lots of pawn shops. And I always associated pawn shops with poverty and sadness and people having to get rid of things. As I said, the right-hand side of William Street I associated with poverty and sadness, and the left-hand side was shiny cars, and selling. And then Forbes Street was the arty part where they had little theatres and things there.
What smells can you remember?
Funnily, mainly the harbour, the fresh smell of the salt on the air. It's a lovely smell. And then magnolia trees. We had magnolia, the heavy magnolia at night. Summer smells I can always remember, except for the harbour. The harbour always smelled lovely, whatever time. But the heavy magnolia at night and the scent of jasmine and all the heavy smells on the summer air, and sitting on warm sandstone steps talking to your friends on a summer night.
Can you remember any big events?
Well, like the building of the harbour bridge, the ballet, the Russian ballet coming out here, the people who came out for concerts in the town hall, all the celebrities that came out. We had quite a few celebrities. The other sort of events...
Can you remember the names of any of those?
Well, there was Lottie Lehman, and there was Philip Hargraves, and who was a child prodigy, and there was Yasha Heifetz, who was a violinist, and the conservatorium fellow called Muir Auld ran that, or he seemed to be a director of some sort, and Percy Granger, and that my mother knew, and
How did your mother know him?
well, my mother moved in musical circles. She played the piano, her sister played the violin, her other sister the cello, and my grandfather the cello, and he belonged to the Sydney Philharmonia Orchestra, and they mixed mainly with musicians. My mother mixed mainly with musicians and people who were literary sort of people. We lived in a sort of real world of literature and music, really. So she knew most of the musical people of Sydney, and I'm trying to dredge up. And she had friends who were theatre actors and people like that. I've got photos of them. They gave her photographs, to Jean, with sort of
Were there any local criminals aside from the Razor gangs?
I don't know. Those sort of things were kept from me. My mother felt that children should have a happy life, so that unpleasant things were kept from me. I wasn't encouraged to read the newspaper. None of us were. You see, we were very sheltered children were then. There was no television. I still remember, yes, one event was when the crystal radio came in, and a friend of mine had been coming home from school and had been run over. Now, you mentioned taxis. Funnily enough, she'd been run over by a taxi, and he was terribly upset, being her fault. She ran across the road, and he bought her a big box of chocolates and his own little crystal set, which he'd made. And I always remember it was a bit of wood with weird little bulbs and things on, all this music came out and talking, and I thought that was interesting. But funnily enough, those sort of inventions never interested me as much as writers or books, or, if I'd met an author or somebody, I'd be thrilled, but those sort of inventions didn't throw me like writing.
Was there ever sort of an option, or was it just sort of considered not on in terms of a job? Like some kids, particularly boys in the Depression, would sell newspapers and scavenge bottles and do ice runs and all sorts of things like that. Did the prospect of you having a little job or something ever?
No, but none of it was the sort of social crowd I suppose I was in. Nobody had jobs, nobody, until they'd left school. I remember all the newsboys. I thought they were quite cute. They used to call out, and they all took it, they took pride in the things they called out, solemnly, terrible murder, etc., and they'd be standing there and they'd have usually bare feet, and they always had bright, cheery faces. They probably weren't cheery, but they always did, and they called all these things out. I always remember the paper boys and everybody coming home from work and getting their evening paper.
Did you go on holidays?
Yes, my mother felt that it was a legacy, I think, from her mother. When I say legacy, I don't mean a money legacy, I mean a mental legacy, that if you lived by the harbour, you had to get in the mountains once a year for your health. And that you should, and say you lived in the mountains, then you must get the harbour. So my cousins, who lived in the country, they all came down and stayed in a flat right on the waterfront in Manly every year for January until they went back to school. And we went to the mountains. We stayed at a lovely holiday place called Mount Gladstone at Bowral, and it had huge Norfolk pines all up the drive. And I remember I was about when I was about 8, I used to climb these 60 foot off the ground. How I did it, I don't know. And it was a lovely old house. And then we stayed 1 year at, even though we lived near the harbour, my mother liked the idea of, it was called La Corniche at Mona Vale. And it was a very glamorous place with fountains and elegant dining room again. And I managed to fall in the fountain once in my best clothes, and then they had a fancy dress ball, and Mother didn't have a lot of money at that stage. I think the Depression was beginning to hit the shares, and so she made me a dress out of crepe paper, and I had a mauve dress like down to my ankles with a poke bonnet. I was Little Miss Victoria. And there was one of the guests got drunk and squirted a soda siphon over me, and all my dress fell to bits and I had to go to bed. I was mortified.
Oh, that was bad luck.
It was, yes, because I was going to be allowed to stay up till the end and I wasn't allowed then, so... And La Corniche was lovely. It was a really old place with turrets and fountains and was right on the beach. And Mount Gladstone was lovely. And then we went to my relations in the country. I stayed on there. They lived in Wellington, New South Wales and Bathurst, and I stayed on their properties and ran round the paddocks, and my cousins teased me and said the sheep were going to go me, and they were all running down the hill, and I really believed them, and they said, city kids, you know.
Yeah. You know, when you were living at, at King's Cross, where did most people do their shopping?
Round the cross. There were, like you knew, the greengrocer, the local greengrocer and the local cake shop, and the, as you mentioned, Morrison's, I think it was, didn't you? Well, people probably did. It's just that I never bought anything like that. They were all bought, so, but I know they went and there was the local butcher, and so they did all their shopping round the cross.
And what about clothes? Where would you buy clothes?
You always went to David Jones for clothes, or Farmers. David Jones or Farmers, they were the main ones, and they're considered, as I said to you, there was a lot of snobbery in those days. McCarthy's and Horden brothers and Anthony Horden's were considered definitely non-new, as not a upper class at all.
Oh. Well, what about things like major purchases? I guess if you were living in a boarding house.
I can't. I'm sorry. I don't know anything about major purchases. It was only clothes that I know about, and food, and where you went for food.
Were there any community organisations?
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
Some of my friends that I went to school with were quite churchy, so they'd go to fellowship on Sunday and things. My mother never made me do things like that, except I stayed with a friend once and we had to go to Sunday school, which I hated.
All right. What were the most popular newspapers?
The Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun at night. Oh, and there was the Truth, which was considered a scurrilous newspaper because it reported everyone's divorces in lurid detail and murder stories, and it was on Sundays, and if you liked to, most people used to say it was rubbish and they wouldn't read it, but I know when, who was it, Robin Eakin, I think, when she got married, she fell in love with somebody else and they reported all her letters and everything. It was a dreadful newspaper.
Well, what magazines would have been?
Well, there was a lovely magazine. You see, my mother didn't buy sort of popular things, but Casno was a photographer, and they had an exhibition of his at the art gallery a while ago, and it was a beautiful magazine with beautiful photos all the way through, and Mother bought that. And then she used to get things like, I'm just trying to think, they were lovely arty magazines, but they came from England. I mean, they were beautiful, they were thick, and they had beautiful pictures and illustrations in them. They were sort of things that you could keep forever because they were so beautifully done. And then there was I just thought of one then. Well, there were the comics I bought as a child. Like there was about a girls' school, a boys' school, Billy Bunter, Chum's Own Annual and Schoolgirl's Own. Yes, and they were about girls and boys at schools. I mean, I bought those. And there was Ginger Meggs, always. You see, everyone liked Ginger Meggs. Everyone read him, even the grown-ups.
What pictures do you remember?
Oh, mostly Hollywood with and girls in those days, they used to get film magazines. That's what I used to get, film magazines, and they used to cut out their favourite film stars and stick them in a scrapbook, like Greta Garbo and Myrna Loy and Clark Gable and Gary Cooper and Charles Boyer, all of those, you know, and we cut them out and we cut out scenes from films and we went to, but they were all those Hollywood films were very unrealistic. As I said, I realise now talking to you that I lived in an unrealistic world, really.
Well, it seemed real enough at the time.
It did, yes.
What songs can you remember?
There was that one I said the old man used to sing that was poor on Thursday afternoon, just a song at twilight, when the lights are low, when the flickering shadows softly come and go. Now I can't remember the rest, but that was quite sad. And then there were all the songs from the Hollywood films. Night and Day, you are the one. And then there was another one, Chloe, through the dark of night, I follow you. They were all very romantic songs. They were all about love and, you know, that was unreal again, you see. It was all about how the girl adored the man adored the woman, and the... Oops, sorry.
It's okay. Can you remember... Can you remember any jokes?
No, you've taken me by surprise. I've never been really much of a joke person. I went through a stage where I used to repeat dirty jokes, and but only to my friends. And then she shamed me one night. She had 4 brothers, and we were all sitting at the table, and she suddenly said, Mum, do you know what Pat told me this morning? Then she repeated the joke, and everyone there was a shocked silence, and they all talked about something else, and I was furious with her. I said, what'd you do that for? She said, I just wanted it for a bit of a laugh. But I felt dreadful.
And you can't remember it?
Yes, I don't think I'd like to repeat it. It's one of those childish... jokes on cocks, actually.
Yeah, go on.
There was a man, something about a man who had hens and cocks and things, and he said, would you catch my cock and pull it? And, you know, this was told, and I mean, I was so embarrassed because those sort of things, that was really dreadful.
Yeah. Any others? Can you remember any others?
Oh, there was a poem when I was a teenager about called Over the Hill, something about, you know, when your mind makes a contact the body can't feel, then you're over the hill, brother, you're over the hill. There was another song, The Green Eye of the Little Yellow God, that people used to, poem they used to recite. And there was another song they sang a lot called She Had to Go and Lose It at the Astor. And you were never quite sure what she lost, but you sort of made up your own thing. In those days, you see, do you want me to go into the wartime when I was living?
Well, what I was going to ask is, can you remember the poem about the green-eyed God?
Oh, no, I've got it written in a book somewhere, but I can't remember, sorry.
Sorry, what else were you going to say then?
I was just going to say that when the war came, it was quite a glamorous life in a way, because I wasn't a very thinking teenager, I don't think. I didn't think of the horrors of war, and all the boys I went out with thought they were going to get killed, so they wanted to spend their money. And there was a very glamorous nightclub called Prince's, which was in Martin Place, and another one called Romano's, which was in Castlereagh Street, and Carl Thomas's, which was cute, which is right down near the Automobile Club in Macquarie Street, just near the steps that go down to Wollongong. And that was sort of more trendy. You know, these days that'd be called trendy, Carl Thomas's. It was overlooked the harbour and it was lovely, and it wasn't quite as expensive as Prince's and Romano's. And Prince's and Romano's were very expensive, and you went there and had a nice meal and danced, and they had these jazz bands, and you know, was it people like Tommy Dorsey and people that, you know, came out and played there, and you danced to these wonderful jazz. Yes, and it was very and then I went out with a fellow who was an engineer on the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary came in the harbour then, you know, that big ship that brought the troops in, and it could never fit right in the harbour, so it used to be up near Taronga Park, and he had lots of money being an engineer and things, and we used to go to Prince's, and then we didn't want to end the night, so we used to go up to, there was a nightclub in Forbes Street, just at the bottom of those stairs that go up from William Street into Forbes Street, and you had to knock on the door, and they looked through a little grill, and you they peered at you, and he must have, through being on a ship, got a pass in, and we used to stay there till 5 in the morning, and then we used to go and have breakfast. And then I, at that stage, had a job because my mother didn't have much money, and she got me to learn typing in shorthand, and I worked in an office, and I used to have to go to work in the same clothes I went out in the night before, trying to look as if I hadn't been out all night, you know. And I thought that was very exciting, because my friends used to tell me, oh, well, you know, there are all sorts of criminals and things in this nightclub, and etc. But don't worry, you're with me, I'll look after you. So I felt very protected.
What major changes did you see when you were living at the Cross?
When? Laughter?
In the 20s and 30s. Was that a period of change?
No, it wasn't, you see. The Arabian coffee shop would have been the main period of change. You see, everything stayed the same, and there were a lot of houses, you know, family houses and things around, and not many flats. There was a flat next to us called Kinneil Court, a building, and I don't know that they're not still there. And then further along were quite elegant terrace houses called the Chimes. That was where Ruth Osborne, the girl with the red hair, lived. And then Macleay Street was very like it is now, with Gowrie Gate and Byron Hall and all those on the left-hand side, the flats. And Springfield Avenue didn't go right through as it does now, and there wasn't the fountain, but it was all very. Now it's of course flats and sex shops and lay girls and everything. It's completely different.
Was there any prostitution up there then?
Yes, there were, but not at the Cross mainly. Most of was in Palmer Street. Yes, the Cross didn't. They didn't go up the Cross. It was only later, when the war started, that the Cross started to get prostitutes up there.
What were the big issues of the time?
Jack Lang cutting the ribbon on the harbour bridge. See, I didn't go in. The war, of course, and all the troops, the Americans.
That was later on. That would have been when you were an adult. What about when you were
young?
Younger.
Well, you see, I wasn't encouraged to think about issues, and my mother didn't really ever talk in front of me about things.
Can you remember the Grey Cliff sinking, the ferry?
No. When was that?
27.
See, I was only 7, and I'd
very
only
young.
been out from Germany 2 years, so I think everything was very strange to me then.
Yeah, I think it would have been. What can you remember of common illnesses?
Oh, I had...
Sorry, common illnesses?
Oh, yes, well, I had mumps and measles.
What about common illnesses?
Yes, I had measles when I was about 7, and I had mumps a bit later, and I thought my throat was so swollen, it looked very funny, and then I got whooping cough, and they didn't realise, and they took my tonsils and adenoids out, and in a glamorous hospital opposite Kinneil called Kirkton Hospital, and then they found I had whooping cough on top of that, so I needn't have had them out. They thought I couldn't get rid of this cough I had, so that's about all.
And can you remember any deaths?
Well, my grandmother died a year after we arrived in Australia, but my mother shielded me from these things, so I don't really remember any deaths at all. Nobody I know that I was fond of seemed to die.
Okay, look, I think I've just about run out of questions. Is there anything you want to say, to add that I've left out?
I think we've covered everything, really.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, this is my great-grandmother. Are you right?
Yep.
And she was born in Norfolk and in 1814. And she was a very intellectual sort of person. She became a Unitarian and belonged to that because it was an intellectual movement. And she was, her family went back to 1100, Charlemagne's time, and their manor is still over in England. It's called Thurning Manor in Norfolk. Her father was a lawyer. And she is descended from Pocahontas, who was a Red Indian princess. And she married, we're descended from, and she still got the Red Indian blood in her because a cousin of mine in Switzerland, who's now 80, went to the eye doctor and he said, have you got coloured blood in you? And she said, back in the 16th century, and he said, you've still got the pigment in your eye. So, is that enough?
Just?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
It's Arthur Martin Beckett. He's my great-grandfather, and he married Emma Louisa. He was a surgeon. He came out in 1838 in the sailing ship with all his possessions, a lot of the furniture I've got here. And he and Emma Louisa had 10 children. And he was in the Legislative Council in Parliament in 1856. He helped found the Unitarian Church in about the same period. And his brother became Chief Justice of Victoria in 1846, and after that it became a fashion for the Becketts to go into law or the church, and because he was descended from Thomas à Becket, and so there was always a Thomas or a William in the family, and they were either in law or the church.
Pat, you were telling me that your father carved that desk there.
Yeah.
What's the story with the desk, Pat?
Well, my father learned art and wood carving and photography, and they were and music, and these things were his hobbies. And he carved this desk for my mother as a love gift. It took him years to do, and he loved carving, as you can see by all the work in it. It's back and front, it's carved all the way around.
It's beautiful.
Yes, it is lovely, isn't it? It's German oak it's carved out of.
And was it sort of a tradition that the German aristocracy learnt things like that?
Yes, they learned art and music and wood carving and things like that, or mostly artistic things. And he happened to be very artistic and liked it.
Mm-hmm.
That's my grandfather. He's Arthur Martin and Emma Louise's son. His name was Marsham à Becket, and that's his sister Alice. Rather sad. She died at the age of 10 because they had to get water from the ponds in Centennial Park, and Sydney Water had typhus in those days, and she died of dysentery. He was a lawyer, and that painting is painted by Marshall Claxton, who's a very well-known early artist of the 1800s. He painted the Dixon family in the art gallery, and he was a friend of the Becketts. The other one, I'll have to look on the back. I know it's an Becket, and it's written on the back. Oh yes, this was painted by Ted à Becket, my uncle, and he was a Royal Academician from the Royal Academy in London. You were only accepted if you were a good artist, and he went to Melbourne Grammar. Melbourne Grammar, and he painted all the headmasters. He was commissioned to paint them, so all their portraits are down in Melbourne Grammar, painted by him. And he was... Is that right?
No.
Yep, that's right. Oh, yep, that's good.
And you see, he was Minnie à Becket's cousin too, the one who married Arthur Boyd, so that they were all painters together. And that little boy that he painted was one of the Wygalls, who was married into the family and became governor of South Australia. That's crooked.
Not for me, it's not.
Oh, good.
Okay.
This is Ingrid and I in the Botanic Gardens, which we used to go on Sundays, walking down from the cross past the conservatorium into the gardens, and then there's one with us in the kiosk, which was an old-fashioned kiosk. Ingrid was very smart in those days. They wore those, what they called cloche hats, head-hugging. And girls of my age wore those horrible black stockings with a light summer dress. outside St Stephen's in Macquarie Street.
Okay, just now let's do these ones here.
Yeah, I'm doing it right now.
That's Dawn Fitzsimmons and yourself, Pat. Which school were you going to?
That was when we were going to Sydney High. We walked through the park in the afternoon to go home often. Hyde Park. They're all Ingrid, aren't they?
No, some of them you've got Mrs. Bell here, and
Oh, they were. Mrs. Bell was one of the residents, other residents. They were people I used to talk to.
and you've got Hope Bruce Isaacs.
Oh,
there.
yes, she lived there. She was the same age as I was, and her mother was English, and her father was. Her father was Jewish, and he was dead, and her mother was English, and she was terribly strict, and she made Hope. I was allowed to go down to dinner at night, but Hope had to have her dinner brought up to her on a tray in her room because Mrs. Isaacs said that no girls of good family had meals when they were grown up, until they were 17 or with the grown-ups in the dining room. Poor Hope, I felt so sorry for her.
And then these other ones over on the left are, well, obviously Rushcutters Bay there. And
That's Ingrid, my sister, and the man she married, Arthur Enway.
And then this is in the garden at Kinneil, is it?
Yes, that's right.
Hmm.
I wish you could had better photos of the garden. It was so huge, and such huge Moreton Bay figs.
So that's where you lived, Kinneil.
Yes, that's right, for a long time.
It must have been wonderful.
Well, it was. It was a very happy time.
See the picture where they're all dressed up in Russian outfits? What's the story behind that?
Oh, well, my cousin, the man there, had been to Russia, and he brought back all these genuine Russian outfits, and they all got dressed in them one afternoon. We used to play charades a lot. Nobody plays charades now. Do you know what charades is? Yes. Well, and, you know, people got dressed up a lot and things in those days and acted little plays.
Girls, are they, Pat?
Yes, they all lived around Elizabeth Bay Road, Billiard Avenue, Ithaca Avenue, down near Elizabeth Bay House, which is still there.
And what school did they go to?
Well, this was called the Glen, and it was a small preparatory school for the Ascombe and the other schools. And they went there simply because we could all go home for lunch.
That would have been how old would you have been then? That would have been before the end of the 20s, do you think? Or maybe 1930?
Oh no, now wait a minute. It must have been about, I think about 1932.
Right.
Got put there?
No?
Oh no.
Okay. This is Pat here with her it says here her favourite rubber duck at Dunrobin, Roslyn Gardens, Darlinghurst, about 1929.
That was opposite Patrick White's house.
Really?
Lulworth it was called.
Hmm. And you went to the beach quite a bit by the look of things here?
Yes, we did. Balmoral, that was.
Mm-hmm. And where's that one over there?
Doesn't it say? I'm quite sure. I think
No, it doesn't.
I think that probably Balmoral. Mother thought Balmoral was good when we were young. Peaceful water.
What's that castle called there?
Well, I don't. What does Glott?
Schloss Glott.
Schloss Glott. Glott.
Is that the castle your father?
Castle is Schloss. That's the one my father was born in. Yes.
Right. That's in Germany.
Yes.
Ah. Looks wonderful. Have you been there as an adult?
No, I should go and find it, I think.
I think so.
Try and find it, yes. It was a famous...
I missed that.
Wait a minute. No, this
Just
one.
a minute.
That one.
These three are Mark Hamburg. He's a famous Jewish pianist who came out here in the, I suppose, 1928 or something. Yes, in that time. He'd been a friend of the family's, so my mother knew him before he came out here.
One of those is dated 9th the 9th, 03.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, then I've got my facts a bit wrong. Maybe that was when she knew him before she left Australia. That probably was. Oh, yes, because he was a marvellous pianist and she absolutely, you know, in those days, well, I suppose people do worship idols these days, and she worshipped his music. And I mean, there was never really any love, romantic attached between them. She admired his music, and she was his sycophant. She, you know, thought he was a marvellous pianist. And of course, all famous pianists likes to have their admirers.
Mm.
These are all actors, these three, and I don't know whether you can read the names. I've forgotten now. They were actors. Mother went to a lot of plays too.
Mm. Well, that's George Boyle.
Oh yes, George Boyle. He was a musician. Now I remember. Now that's good you got that. George Boyle was a musician. This is an actor, and I would, if Mother used to talk to me about these, but like all children, you know, you listen with half an ear to what your mother tells you.
And the fellow in the middle is Guy de Leon.
Oh, Guy de Leon, yes, he played Lilium, isn't it? I think, and this one looks like an Italian opera singer. What does it? Is he?
Something or other, I don't know.
No.
1924.